Good afternoon, everyone. It's Jeremy Benamy, president of J Street, coming to you from Washington, D.C., here on Word on the Street Live. It is 4 p.m. on Wednesday when we are going to be releasing this, but we're actually taping today in advance with Peter Lerner, who is the Director of International Affairs for Israel's labor union called the Histadrut. I'm here with Ilan Goldenberg is Chief Policy Officer and Senior Vice President at J Street, and together we're going to be having a conversation with Peter about the situation in Gaza. He was the international spokesperson for the IDF at the very beginning of the war, and for 25 years in his service in the Israel Defense Forces as a spokesperson and liaison officer. So it's going to be a really interesting conversation. Ilan, I'm really looking forward to this. But we're also going to take a little bit of time at the end and talk about some of the other issues that are swirling around. We're just back from our own trip. We were there for a week in Israel and Palestine with a really interesting delegation. Both of us have written a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, and one of the people we saw while we were there was Peter, and we sat down for what was a really lovely and thoughtful dinner with a whole bunch of different experts and just members from Israeli and Palestinian society. And so actually, Peter, start with you. Like, you and I have talked about this before, and your experiences on October 7th, and how you felt that day, and then the evolution from like the work you did in the immediate aftermath, as a reservist going back into the IDF, to how you're thinking about things now and kind of that journey over the last couple of years.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm a huge supporter of you guys. I think you're doing a really important job for connecting between Israel and the US. And I think that from my perspective, when you invite me to come and meet your folks, I will drop everything and try and meet that, because I think it's really important to have this ongoing dialogue as a bridge. I came back from the US on October 5th, 23, from a bat mitzvah trip for my daughter. I was in the early hours of that morning, I was still jet lagged on the 7th. And I was lying in bed doing what people do when they can't sleep, scroll through my social media. And then the app on my phone, the red alert, started to sound. And the amount of rockets just caused this endless pinging. My wife was next to me, and it woke her up. She wasn't asleep in the early hours of that morning. And she said, "Peter, what's happening?" I said, "There are rockets being fired down south." And as I said, down south, we had a siren here where we live in Ramat Gan, which is just east of Tel Aviv. And so we got up, we got my daughter out of her bed. She wasn't happy to be woken up. And we went down to the shelter, and we waited the compulsory 10 minutes before coming back upstairs to the living room. And then I turned the television on, and we were standing in front of the television, and Liat, my wife, we were watching the terrible images of the paragliders coming over the fence in northern Gaza into southern Israel, in Netiv HaSara, Kfar Aza, and she looks at me and she says, "Peter, they're coming for us." And I think that was a very, very strong moment for me. I hadn't been in military service in reserve duty not more than 1 or 2 days since I'd retired in 2017. So I retired. I had no intention of going back. I didn't think they'd need me. I'm already pushing 52. Why would they call on me? They're a younger, brighter, more capable people. And but when my wife said that to me, I felt I had to do something, because I also felt that this was a moment where Israeli society had to step up. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about left or right. It was about doing the right thing for our society. And so I did what I knew to do. I phoned up the unit and I said, "I have a bit less hair up top and a bit heavier around the midsection. If you want me, I will come in." And basically, the international spokesperson at the time said, Peter, we've got it. We're okay for the time being. It was a polite, don't call us, we'll call you. And I respect that. It was something that I needed to do. So I didn't go in on the 7th. What I actually did on the 7th is I sat down and wrote an opinion piece about the failures of the military on the 7th. 2 days later, on the 9th, they called me in and asked me to come in on the 10th. And basically, I did something like 360 days of reserve duty in the spokesperson's unit. I met delegations from J Street during those times, and I communicated, must have done around 700 interviews, briefings, engagements with different audiences across the world. I think, and for most Israelis, and even up until probably a year ago, there is a very, very strong sense of this is a just war. It's a war that is required. It's something that needs to change the reality on the ground. And so while war always needs to be the last resort, this was the last resort to try and create that change. And for me, being retired for so long, and the need to come and do something for my family, for my community, for my society, I would even say for my people, to be that voice of reason. I thought it would, and I felt that it was a huge privilege to wear the uniform of the IDF once again. That's obviously, so I came back into the military like after 7 or 8 years, and over the last 2 years, I've done a few days just since the beginning of the year, but most of it was 23, 24. The war has evolved as my positions and understanding of how the war is being conducted has evolved. I would say this today, I don't envy my colleagues in the IDF spokesperson's unit. I think the biggest challenge it was identifying when, from the military and strategic perspective, when can that tipping point of declaring victory and ending the war be realized? Now, we have today 50 hostages that are still being held by Hamas. So there is which indicates that Hamas is still strong enough to hold them. And every day there are engagements and more strikes from the Israeli perspective and more attacks from the Hamas perspective. So there's this skirmishing that is taking place constantly, which means that the war hasn't ended yet. But I feel that the strategic victory that could have been declared a year ago, or many months ago, if not a year, but it could have been transferred into what I believe is the fundamentals of the foundations of war. It is a political tool. War is political intercourse by other means. And if that's the situation, then what are the political goals? And I think this is where Israel has been stuck from the beginning. The political goals have been this mishmash, this exchange, the inflammatory comments by ministers, and the lack of clarity from the government and on what is the end state. Who will control Gaza after Hamas is defeated? How will we identify that Hamas is defeated? Is it just when we have the hostages back or not? And I think that these questions have created a new reality for Israel. And I think this is where we are bringing up to where we are today, where the cabinet made their decision to take control, they say, of Gaza City as a prelude to taking control over the remaining areas that Netanyahu pointed out in his press conference this week, Gaza City and the central camps of the Gaza Strip. And when that announcement came out, I was taken aback. I mean, I've been vocal about various issues, but with this, I think, is the strategic mistake that Israel can make. It will be bad tactically because we will spill more blood of our soldiers. It will be bad tactically because more strife, more suffering on the people of Gaza, the people of Gaza City, who, if 1 million people are need to be evacuated from the city, how will they do that? Where will they go? Who will deal with them? And even if that happens, they can't ensure that everybody will actually leave, which means legally the IDF will have to have responsibility. And I think that is the catastrophe. Israel does not need to control the lives of the people of Gaza. That is the reason why Israel left the Gaza Strip, and that, I think, would be a burden on Israeli society. It would be a burden that fuels radicalism in Palestinian society, and specifically in Gaza. And I think, most importantly, it will not ensure that the hostages come home alive, or that we're able to retrieve the bodies of those that are deceased. So when you put all of those components together, before we even talk about the international arena and how this is being messed up, I think that when we look at that, what we know is, for it to succeed, there are too many ifs. If this works, if this doesn't happen, if that, and then I believe that there are too many question marks for it to be successful. I would also weigh on the last attempt to do a strategic shift, the issue of shutting off the flow of humanitarian supplies at the beginning of March. And even though it wasn't 100%, that area was a combat zone, and the international organizations couldn't pick up their stuff. And then in May, the GHF, April, May, the GHF came to the Gaza Humanitarian Fund. They came to realization and tried to conduct their activities. And when you look at that attempt to do a strategic shift, it also failed. It failed miserably, I would say, in a way that created a huge uproar, international uproar, that the government were not prepared to deal with. And it created this unification of positions that Israel is not equipped to deal with in this government.
And
I could go on for hours. This is just, they used to pay me to be a spokesperson, so I would speak and speak and speak. If you don't give me a question,
yeah.
So I'll have a sip.
I was going to say, for us, we're taping this in the morning East Coast time, so I'm having my cup of coffee to keep me going here, and it's evening time for you in Ramat Gan, and you're having a very meaningful beverage. I don't know if you want to just take a second and comment on this.
That's a special edition beer from a brewery in Jerusalem called Shapira Brewery, and this is in memory of Hirsch Goldberg Polin. And on the sticker, I don't know if you could see that, it says love, and it says in Hebrew and Arabic, ahava, peace, yep. Shalom, salam, and light, no. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a positive uplift to the end of my day here in Israel as I'm speaking to you. And it's meaningful. This week I met in the Histadrut, we met with members of the families, representatives of the families, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. We have engagements with them, and we've supported their efforts since establishing the forum for the families. And this is what it's all about: people. And I think this is our challenge in Israel, is to see people, whether Israelis or Palestinians in Gaza. And I think this is sometimes our policy makers are a bit blind to people like Hirsch.
And those three words, you may remember this, Ilan, because you dealt with his parents around the Democratic Convention, but those three words were part of some sign that he had, right, in his bedroom, I believe. I mean, I think that there's a specific meaning to that set of three words that have something personal related to him. I don't know if either of you know that story.
I don't, but it's very just consistent with everything about his history and his story and what I do know of his story, and the way, John and Rachel have spoken both about him and about the issues. I mean, for how they spoke at the Democratic National Convention, and the message they sent there, which again, just a message of humanity, a message of suffering everyone is going through. And so It is a beautiful message. And I mean, like you said, Peter, such a sharp contrast, unfortunately, to some of the messages we hear coming out of the Israeli government right now. I did want to, Peter, like, dive with you a little bit deeper, maybe. I mean, I think we started talking about the Netanyahu's plan or sort of the plan for the full occupation of Gaza. Where do you kind of see that going from here over the next couple months? And is there a way out of it still?
So first of all, today, the development of today was the Chief of Staff has apparently approved the concept of operation, so how they foresee the operation of taking control of Gaza City. They're very, very careful not to call it the occupation because of the legal requirements, because of what it actually means. But I think they will go into a planning process that after understanding what the concept of operation is, then it will be what forces are required, what is each task each unit has, how does it work with combined operations from air force to naval forces and ground forces, and how it all comes together. So I think we will have some time. Netanyahu spoke this week, and he said that he's asked the military to do it quicker than what the military planned. So it could be something that actually happens quite quickly. The mobilization of the forces, they will plan as if it's going to happen 100%. I mean, it doesn't matter. I feel that it's a mistake. That's my personal, personal opinion based on what I shared with you. But the military, if there were any thoughts that perhaps the Chief of Staff would resign over this, he's not going to resign. I don't. That's not going to happen. He will continue push forward, and he will try and craft and design the operation to achieve the goals of saving the hostages on one hand, and limiting the friction with the people of Gaza City on the other hand. And I think the second question is, can it be averted? What you asked there, Ilan, I think, is it can be averted. I think the keys are in the hands of President Trump. I think he has the ability to stop this. I think he has the ability to encourage Netanyahu to take a different path. And that path can be a path that will be beneficial for Israel, beneficial for regional for security, and avert the catastrophe that could be brought upon us by taking control, reoccupying the Gaza City. So I think it can be realized. I think that is, I mean, how can that be realized? I think is maybe the question. What will encourage President Trump to do that? Who are the people that can make President Trump put the pressure on Netanyahu? That I think is the only way that it will be stopped. Otherwise, and maybe I heard President Trump earlier over the weekend or earlier this week, it looks like he's not really going to get involved, at least this stage. But maybe there are things happening behind the scenes that have not yet been exposed with regard to, we did hear that there is some talk about reigniting the negotiations for a hostage deal to release the hostages. So maybe there is something positive there, and maybe the pressure around preventing the war developing further into Gaza City will be averted anyway. So there are a lot of maybes and question marks. I think the only thing that is certain is that if it does happen in Gaza City, it will be terrible.
Well, speaking of being terrible, I wanted to shift a little bit over to the humanitarian situation. We've talked a bit about the military side of things, security, and what the options are diplomatically. But I think what really has the world's attention is the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And we get a lot of mixed information, a lot of conflicting stories, and the official channels of when we were there, Elon and I, we met with your successors, from the IDF, and we received the official party line, which is that there's no famine, that there's no shortage, and everything that is a problem is actually a problem because of interference from Hamas or other actors on the other side of the fence. That is not where the rest of the world sees this. Obviously, it's not what one hears from aid workers and from doctors and from the limited journalists that are there. We get, daily reports from NPR from a producer who's on the ground, who talks about the hunger in his own family. And we actually spoke to somebody from one of the Israeli NGOs who had been in Gaza until very recently and is now out and is in Amsterdam. The family is still there, and he described personally the shortages and the impact on his own family. So I'm curious, how can you help us to sort through the stories here? What are there things that you think that are more reliable than other sources? What is the source of truth as we try to understand what is really happening on the ground?
So I mean, first of all, the biggest problem is the lack of acknowledgement that there is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza from the Israeli side. Both of those statements, that there is no famine and there are disruptions on the supply chain, can be true. But if you're not showing that you care about what's happening on the other side, I think it creates this huge animosity that Israel has been met with. So I would say, on the basis on my judgment, I would say, first of all, there's clearly a humanitarian crisis, and people are suffering, and people are at loss for trying to get supplies for their family. What would you do if you had been cut off from the world, and the supplies were coming in, and you needed to get supplies, basic supplies for the survival of your family? And I think that is the challenge that Israel has tried to face with the GHF program. I think that Israel tried to.
And that GHF, by the way, is the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which was set up in the wake of the shutdown in March. And then Israel said to the standing international organizations that had been handling this, we no longer want to work this through you. We're setting something else up.
Israel has concerns with how the international organizations are able to distribute in Gaza. Even over the last, yesterday, the IDF released some footage of a vehicle that had a World Central Kitchen sticker on its roof. And World Central Kitchen had confirmed that this is not one of their vehicles. And the IDF identified it, that it had been used, the sticker, the emblem, the symbol, had been used by terrorists. So this is the playoff. This is the trade-off, and this is, I think, that the deep distrust between Israel and the international community, international organizations, the abuse of international symbols, is a challenge for everybody, for the organizations that want to do good work for people, for the workers of those organizations themselves that find themselves on the front line all the time. And of course, for the IDF soldiers that are positioned in and around those areas in Gaza, and they see a vehicle coming towards them, and they don't know if it's going to blow up or if terrorists are going to come out with RPGs and all of those types of dilemmas that they have. So I would say it is most important to figure out how to work together. I think there's the problem with the international communities; they've not acknowledged any of Israel's concerns. So everybody buckled down. And if you buckle down, then you're always going to be head to head. You're not going to be able to get the help to the people that actually require it. And of course, I think there's the challenge is from the Israeli perspective is the concern that the aid is fueling Hamas's war effort, either by public support or by controlling the population through it, or by bringing in, by making a profit out of it, by selling it at high prices on the market. So I would say, yes, this was probably the situation up until around 2 weeks ago. When Israel opened, finally, the decision, and I don't know, it's not come to light, but that in my gut instinct tells me that it was probably an intervention by President Trump, because it happened overnight and everything was like, the instructions were open everything, let all of the international organizations, let them make sure that they pick up the supplies from Kerem Shalom, where there'd been thousands and thousands and thousands of food parcels waiting to be picked up, and they hadn't picked them up for reasons that, well, some of them are operational, but some of them probably are also political. You want to do with the GHF, you're stuck with the problem yourself. And so I would say we've seen a huge surge of supplies going in. I did see a report earlier today on social media, so it's not confirmed, but it's in line that Hamas announced yesterday that only Hamas will be accompanying the food and the food convoys, supplies coming in, and that there was a strike against those Hamas operatives in northern Gaza today. So this is the type of dilemma that the Israeli defense establishment is in. How do you manage to have a flow of humanitarian supplies on one hand, but it goes to those that are actually in need? So I would say there's been a huge, circle back to your question, I think there's been a huge surge in supplies that are going in. The reports of the prices of goods have gone extremely down, which indicates that there is a good level of supply in Gaza Strip, and it still doesn't change the reality that it is an ongoing war and people are suffering. And if you put all of that together, it needs to be managed in a way which sees the people, sees the needs, and thinks of solutions. And I would say, ideally, together with those that are the operators of distribution. Where are the problems? What are our problems? How do we do it together? Sorry.
I'll just add that we're going to be having a webinar tomorrow. J Street is running a webinar for those who are watching. We're now on Word on the Street Live, and that is running as of 4 p.m. Eastern on Wednesday. But on Thursday, we're going to be having a J Street webinar on the humanitarian situation, and we will be talking to somebody who used to work for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and has some real issues with how it has been set up, and also with the Israeli human rights organization Gisha, and Tanya Hari, who you probably know, Peter, and she runs Gisha, and we'll be talking to the two of them in more depth about this if folks are interested in digging in on that. So Elon, I think you wanted to pick up on this.
Yeah, and I just wanted to hop in on this because this is Peter, especially what you described, I saw when I was working in the US government, this kind of dysfunctionality and disconnect between the humanitarian organizations and the IDF. That's 100% accurate, and I think makes the situation all that much worse. At least what our humanitarian experts were consistently saying in the US government. And I go back actually first to your point about the Israeli military and the government has to show this level of empathy, sympathy, humanity. When it doesn't, and it just says, and that also goes to just international standing and your old job as international spokesperson, right? If you just don't show that level of humanity, you're going nowhere. The other,
go
ahead.
I was just going to jump in because in one of my roles in the military, I served as an international liaison officer. So I dealt with these international organizations, and the whole concept of operation was these organizations are strategic enablers. And when you turn your back on your strategic enablers, then you have this heavy burden of responsibility that is it is only going to build up against you. And that, I think, has been the biggest failure of this. A war that is legitimate, 100% legitimate following October 7th, needed to be managed in a way that can enable achieving the goal. And if you have this huge problem of dealing with people, real people that have real needs, and you ignore that, then it undermines your war effort.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I would say on this is, at least from the American perspective, all of our human sort of assistance people consistently said that in every single conflict such as this one, the single best thing you can do to avoid the enemy using aid as a tool of war is to just flood the zone to a point where prices drop. Because Hamas people, these guys, they're going to eat no matter what. The guys with guns are going to eat no matter what. That's never going to change. The question is, do they have the ability to take a bunch of this aid and use it to sell it, to leverage power? And where there's so much food that everybody is eating, they can't do that. And when there isn't, that's when they have power. And so I really think this has been a fundamental lack of understanding on the IDF's part and the Israeli government's part, is that the best thing that would be the morally right thing would also put Israel in the best position internationally. Oh, by the way, would also do the most to weaken Hamas is to just flood the zone with food. And that's what so many of us who, are supporters of Israel, were there for Israel on October 7th and in the aftermath, but also just horrified by some of the things that are happening now, like keep trying to tell people. It just doesn't seem to be getting through necessarily.
I agree. I mean, humanitarian aid isn't a concession; it's a necessity. It's something that needs to be pushed, initiated, engaged. As I said, the strategic enabler that allows you to continue to do the war as long as you need to do it. And people are concerned that you can't do the war if you're not treating with the people, treating the people on the ground that need that help. And that's what we've seen in this big pushback. And it's created this whole essence of deliberation around, okay, what do we need to do to try and convince Israel that you can't conduct the war like this? And so you have the initiatives of recognition of Palestine, which is statementomacy. Like, it's another level of diplomacy, but it's just statements that have very, very little bearing on reality, and it won't change the reality for the Palestinians in Gaza or in the West Bank. It might give some people around the world a warm, fuzzy feeling, but Israel needs to understand that this is undermining Israel's own legitimacy, and creating a huge disruption of, when the Chancellor of Germany says we're not going to send any arms to Israel, that is a big, serious red flag to Israel. That is not something we should take lightly, and we definitely shouldn't shrug it off. There's something that's a message that is very, very, it echoes around society, and it's just one indicator of where things are going to go. And if we don't take notice of it, it's just going to get much, much worse. And still, we won't be able to achieve goals of getting rid of Hamas, which, none of these world leaders have said, don't get rid of Hamas. They said, do it, but make sure that the people aren't suffering too much.
And I'm curious, the question of what is the message received from these international actions and from this growing international isolation? I understand that the leadership of this government is not being moved by that, right? Their essential worldview is, well, it doesn't matter even if everybody is against us. We are going to move ahead and do what we see is right, and it's full steam ahead no matter what. But in the public domain, where there is a rising opposition to this war, to this decision, and you see hundreds of very senior military officials saying this is not the right decision, and you see protests, and you see the building up, towards Sunday, for instance, a day of action in Israel. Are these international actions seen in the public as a reasonable response to a government that's doing the wrong thing strategically, or does it tend to make the public recoil and say, well, the whole world hates us, and maybe we should just circle the wagons? I'm curious the impact on public opinion of the world taking these kinds of positions.
So I think it's complex, and it's definitely not a very, very clear line when you ask me to try and generalize it about Israeli society. Israeli society now for the last 3 years has been extremely divided over key issues of Israeli society. I think with regard to the war, though, 80% of the public are for ending a deal to release all of the hostages, even if it means ending the war now. And this, I think, is perhaps it relates to all of the prices Israel is paying for the prolongation of this war, even before we question why is the war ongoing. The inflammatory rhetoric that the ministers are talking about is about denying the humanitarian needs or wiping out Gaza. This isn't. People are seeing it not as diplomacy, but as self-sabotage. And I would add that it undermines those goals that we are trying to achieve, and the world generally agrees. Hostages need to come home, Hamas needs to go. So I would say, yes, the Israeli society want the war over, and they want the hostages back. There is a concern about its implications. I think there is a realization, the day of action that will happen on Sunday is symbolic. I was sitting with in the Histadrut, our labor federation, which is we have something like over 800,000 members. It's 25% of Israel's workforce are organized by our unions. It is the founding organization that laid the foundations for everything Israel. Bank HaPoalim was a Histadrut enterprise. Bank HaPoalim literally means the workers' bank. And it's just one example, and everything from cradle to grave, and everything was basically organized by the Histadrut. And so the involvement of the Histadrut in Israeli society, from a trade union perspective, but from also as a social movement, is one of that, with regard to when we see the consequences of the war on our economy, when we see how it is tearing society apart, and when we see the lack of solidarity to the weakest, the most vulnerable, whether it's in the society, but in this case, it's the families of the 50 hostages. It's something that also weighs on how we move forward. So if we would try and point to where we're trying to go now, if we're looking forward, I think Israeli society is trying to understand where is Israel going to be. And I think this is a question Israeli society is going to have to ask itself. What does it mean to be a Zionist after Gaza? And I think that is a debate that Israeli society is going to have to go through. And I think when we look at the consequences of this war towards the international community, inside Israeli society, vis-a-vis the relationship with the Palestinians, but also in the region, and also the relationship between Israel and the Jewish diaspora, I think when you put all of those together, Israel has a very, very big challenge to try and identify those. This war has brought all of these problems front and center for Israeli society now to deal with.
Well, Peter, I think that's an incredibly good way to wrap up our conversation. The challenges that lie ahead in this phase of Israel's history are really existential and fundamental to what the country is, what it's going to be, what its relation will be with the people immediately that it lives with its circle of neighbors, with the rest of the world. And you've outlined the stakes and the challenges at the moment really well. I see from the lighting on you that the sun is setting.
Going down.
I know that
slowly,
light at 7:15
slowly.
so on a summer evening.
Yeah.
So we will let you go and enjoy the evening. And thank you very much for your insights and for joining us here on Word on the Street Live, and for the cooperation over the years with our J Street work as we try to help American leadership and American politicians, Jewish community leaders understand the ins and the outs of Israeli society. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Peter.
Jeremy. Thank you, Ilan. It's always a pleasure to join you guys. Solidarity to you and the whole hard work that you're doing over there in the US. Thank you very much.
We'll see you soon, I'm sure.
So folks, we're going to stay on for another 15, 20 minutes or so and wrap up our weekly conversation here with a little bit of a discussion of some of the other topics that are out there in the air. And this is just an extraordinary time, Elon, with so much focus on these issues in the social media conversation, in the mainstream media conversation, and so many very, very difficult and challenging topics that are being addressed. So the New York Times recently ran 2 interviews in different podcast lanes that it has. One happens to be one of my favorites, which is Ezra Klein's regular podcast, and he interviewed the Columbia grad student Mahmoud Khalil, who was one of the very first targets of the Trump administration and its efforts to arrest and try to deport critics of Israel. And so Ezra interviewed Khalil, and then Lulu Garcia Navarro, who is doing a weekly interview series as part of the Daily podcast, another of my favorite podcasts. She interviewed Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of the Anti-Defamation League, in an in-depth two-part, over an hour conversation. And it's really interesting. You have some very strong reactions to the one-sided nature of both of these two conversations. And I thought it'd be interesting to explore that a little bit with you.
Yeah, sure. And like we're getting a little self-referential when we're doing podcasts on podcasts. But yeah, look, I came to J Street precisely as we've talked about before, and I've said on the show, because I felt like in the aftermath of October 7th, we had this massive split between those who went kind of hard right, like support Israel no matter what, and those who went like off the rails on the left with like unvarnished criticism to the point of, even sometimes bordering into anti-Semitism and some of the behavior. And I find it very frustrating that so many of the voices and conversations that you put into the biggest platforms like represent those two extremes, when the reality is like so much of the American Jewish community and so many Democratic voters and Americans, like the overwhelming majority, are neither of those two ends. And I felt like some of the discussion on these two podcasts really did that. I mean, starting with Mahmoud Khalil, who, the thing that's interesting is like with both him and Greenblatt, a lot of things that are interesting and either I agree with or I disagree with, but like I can see where they're coming from. With Mahmoud Khalil though, like he professed to like not being anti-Semitic, and I believe him, and he's got Jewish friends, and yet like when he's asked about October 7th, like just the inability to say, like, to condemn Hamas, to condemn that day, to really just be very explicit in saying that some of the things that happened that day were absolutely horrific. And you listen to the podcast and that piece was just incredibly frustrating and infuriating. And like, is he an anti-Semite? I don't know. I don't really care. I just don't really want to associate my views and like serious engagement with somebody who, ultimately can't do that. Like, they're a voice. They need to be listened to and heard. I don't think that he necessarily, like violating his civil rights isn't the answer. And like,
Right, well, I just want to make that clear that obviously none of this is in
right.
any stretch of the imagination the basis to have him arrested and held in Louisiana for 2 months without being able to see his wife and newborn child.
100%. But I was just like, came away like super frustrated that this is the voice that's being represented.
Right.
And
The frustration being at the New York Times, really, not so much at him, let's say.
yeah, well, I mean, I'm frustrated with him for his
Right, exactly, right.
to, condemn that horrific day. Frustrated at the New York Times that like you're gonna do this. And then on the other side with Greenblatt, again, a lot of things that I that I was fine with or I didn't find offensive, maybe disagreed with, maybe didn't, but he really dove deep into just doubling down on like anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism, and argued that basically, if you were denying the Jewish people's right to self-determination, like you're an anti-Semite. Like that was basically, he kept saying it again and again. And I have a real problem with that too, because like, what about Palestinians who like lost their homes in 1948 and are now sitting in Gaza, for example? People who, have no problems with Jews, but want to go back to live where they lived, have a terrible trauma and the narrative of their own, not my narrative, not your narrative, but one of the narratives of this conflict. They're not necessarily saying push all the Jews into the sea. Some of those extremists exist too. Many of them are just saying like, we want democracy, we want our rights, we want, a home of our own, back where we were. I don't agree with the ones. I don't think the one state reality sort of, it makes sense. I think, I am, as we've talked about, I'm very much a liberal Zionist, but I don't think you want to label all those people anti-Semites. And according to Jonathan's definition, like those people are all anti-Semites. And it also, like, what about Israelis who don't want to, have a Palestinian state? Maybe a lot of them, I mean, you have the extremists like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, but you have a lot of people who have genuine security concerns about a Palestinian state. Israelis who just don't believe it's possible to have a Palestinian state in the West Bank, because of security concerns. We need to convince them. We need to engage with them. But if they are denying, Palestinian rights to self-determination, does that mean they're all anti-Palestinian? Does that mean they're all racist against Palestinians? Like, do we want to label them in that way? And so I found that particular piece of the discussion from Jonathan, like, and just associating like people who view that as the same as the results of all the very horrible anti-Semitic stuff that has actually happened in this country, attacks, singling out Jews for behavior of the Israeli government, some of the horrible things that have happened in Washington and Colorado. You can't just mix all those things together. And so I just found, like, on this biggest of all podcast platforms, which is the New York Times podcast, to just have these two ends, like kind of just listening to them essentially back to back, like pretty irritating. Although you had a different experience with something I haven't listened to yet from the New York Times, so you're feeling more sympathetic to the New York Times podcasting world right now.
So yeah, so the one thing I would recommend to our viewers and listeners is this week's Ezra Klein show. So the one that follows the Mahmoud Khalil, because clearly there's nothing else for Ezra Klein to be talking about these days than the topics related to what's going on in Israel. But he did a really terrific, nuanced, in-depth exploration of the issue of genocide with Philippe Sands, who is a British academic professor, one of the world's leading experts on the question of international law and genocide. And I just thought it was over an hour, and it's a tutorial in international law and in the history of the Genocide Convention and the people in the 1930s and 40s who were really creating the entire field of international law, which didn't exist, right? The international human rights law, the concept that individuals had rights that states could violate, and what were exactly the statutes, and how does the the war crimes generally differ from international humanitarian law, from the law around genocide, and what are the exact distinctions, and what were the intents of the people who wrote these statutes versus what the statutes ended up being, and then the courts over the course of the decades, how they've interpreted those statutes, which differ from the way in which people intended it when it was written. It was just fascinating. And the distinction on the word genocide, I wrote a piece, as probably everybody who's listening to this knows, about this word and the exploration of it. And what Philippe Sands was saying, the professor, there is such a vast gulf between the cultural conversation around this word and the actual legal argumentation and the legal definitions. And there is such emotion that every single, he went through a number of instances, in the Balkans, the Croats and the Bosnians had different experiences in the international courts and taking their claims against the Serbs over what happened during the wars of the 90s. And the fact that the courts wouldn't find genocide was just so emotionally outrageous, because people want to have the notion that this is the single worst thing that could possibly have ever happened to their people, and they want it called genocide because that word is taken to be the ultimate crime of crimes. But that isn't, the courts and the legal structure. Genocide is on a par with all the other international crimes, right? It is not a higher level crime. And it was just fascinating. I really enjoyed it. I highly recommend that you listen to it, because I think you'll find it really interesting. But I highly recommended that the people listening to our podcast and who have been engaging in our comments, there are hundreds and hundreds of comments on this one Substack, and I really recommend people listen to this.
Yeah, although I will say, I just always come back and I have to say it, and I know, Jeremy, you very much agree with me on this. So whenever we have this conversation about genocide, like, always starts from the position of, like, it matters so much more that what we do to try to stop the war and alleviate the suffering than, like, what we call it. And, like, we hear that, you and I heard it again from Palestinian, who had just been in Gaza when we were in Israel. Like, I don't care about recognition and genocide and all these arguments. Like, let's just stop the war and stop the suffering. So we need to engage with all these other things because people care about, because they're heavy, emotional, and important issues. But also just important for us to always, like, keep that North Star, which is certainly what we're doing at J Street.
And it's also a North Star about morality, because no matter whether or not a court ultimately does hold, and it's going to be years from now when somebody ultimately renders a legal verdict on this, they may not find the requisite intent was present to satisfy the legal standard for this particular crime. That doesn't matter. What is happening is immoral, just simply flat out, and it's immoral on a human level. But I have to say that as a Jew, right, as an American Jew, as somebody with a deep connection to the state of Israel, the treatment of another people is fundamental to my Jewish ethics. And you don't treat other people the way you didn't want to be treated yourself. And the notion that the state and the government of this, particular government is doing things that are leading to conditions where people don't have the medicine, they don't have the food, they don't have the water that they need to survive, to me is simply un-Jewish. And I think that whatever you label it, whatever you call it, one has to have a moral clarity about this, as well as, going back to Peter, the strategic stupidity of doing this, right? Because it's so damaging to the status of Israel in the international sphere and the support for its war effort. It strategically makes no sense, and it's morally abominable.
Yeah, no, and I will say, like, and that was one of the things I appreciated in the discussion with Peter, and having been, a DoD guy myself, having spent years working at the Pentagon, really, framing it a little bit differently than we usually hear it on this podcast. Less in the moral, less even in partially in the policy, but really in the military strategy of, like, in addition to all those other things, like, this just makes no strategic sense for Israel. From a purely military perspective of, I want to win a conflict, I want to put my country in the best position, like, this is actually, like, I thought quite a message that he was sending with some of his analysis from a bit of a different way of thinking. So I very much appreciated that.
All right. Well, I think we've covered the full terrain of New York Times podcasts over the course of the last week. There's a lot for people to listen to. If you're having trouble sleeping, just plug in the podcast and listen to people drone on for hours about all of these really very, very complex and highly emotional issues. And I'm sure it'll put you right to sleep to listen to 3 hours worth of podcasts on all of this stuff. But very good discussion today with Peter. Ilan, it was great to travel with you last week. Thank you to everybody for tuning in. This is Word on the Street Live. We come to you every Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern. Sometimes we tape, as we have today. Sometimes we are live, and we certainly welcome your comments in Substack on what we've been covering here, and we'll keep the conversation going there. And both Ilan and I will have more to say on all of these topics on our podcast and other posts on Word on the Street in the weeks ahead. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Ilan.
Care.
All right. Take care, everybody.